Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be talking about Afghanistan and the extraordinary sequence of events that we've seen over the past week. I think when I initially sort of named this thing and advertised it, I was promising a good deal of rage. Over the past 3 days, as I've seen what's happened, that rage is beginning to be replaced by something like hope. I think there's an extreme degree of misunderstanding of what the U.S. Afghan project was. And I think today will provide a little clarity, which I think will give you a better sense of why it is phenomenal that it is over. And what has actually changed my approach to things the most is the realization that, in fact, this thing that's being portrayed as such a tragedy in the U.S. press, the collapse of the non-Taliban government, might actually mean that the Afghan people dodged a bullet of a horrific civil war like the one they experienced after the Soviets left. So we'll get into all of this. I just wanted to say from the start, this isn't going to be as rage-filled and angry as you might have hoped. You want rage, you can look at my last Afghanistan video on the channel. There's some real anger there that will come through in this as well. But actually looking at the broader picture, I'm beginning to become almost optimistic. And I'll explain that as we get on. Before we dive into it, let's do some preliminaries. If you're new here, you'll see there's a live chat that's going. In that live chat, you are encouraged to get into it with other people there to have discussions, arguments, what have you. We are tremendously open-minded as to what you can say. We tend to get angry at the openly genocidal, nuke Afghanistan. We don't find that kind of shit funny. But generally, you can, say pretty much what you want. What you cannot do is attack other people in the chat. Feel free to say whatever you want to say about me, my apartment, my stupid haircut, whatever the ideas, certainly the ideas that I'm expressing. Say anything you want about me, but you are not allowed to attack other people in the chat or disrupt the chat by, say, spamming, garbage. Logo Cool Extreme is the moderator. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. If he thinks you're annoying, you're out. What this means in practice is that if you are behaving in a way that is against the rules of the chat that Loga and I have agreed on, Loga will warn you. If you do not listen to him, he will block you. And again, it's entirely up to Loga. Loga Cool Extreme. So listen to him if he tells you you are acting inappropriately. Please do hold off from any questions for me. The way this is structured is I have a presentation that's going to take half hour, 45 minutes, maybe as long as an hour. And then after that, for the second hour of the presentation, and probably some of the first hour as well, I'll be doing question and answer. And I will be answering people's questions. And that's also the right time to do super chats if you are so inclined. Super chats or folks can send me tips or what have you. Please hold off on super chats because I don't deal with the chat at all until I'm done with the presentation. All right, let's talk Afghanistan. I think I've gotten a really valid critique from friends and family that in my behavior on social media, certainly in the past day or so, I've begun to almost seem gleeful about what has happened in Afghanistan, and that is, I think that's a valid critique, and I think that I need to start this by centering the Afghan people. What we have been doing to the people of Afghanistan for the past 20 years is horrific. They've been used as a pawn. The ongoing destruction of their country has been the U.S. policy, with a little sprinkling of like, oh, look, we're building schools for girls, as we, intentionally kept this horrific civil war churning and kept it going. What we've done to the Afghan people is nightmarish. The Taliban are not a nice group of people. The fact that they are an indigenous resistance group may be in their favor, but it's very clear that they are some of the worst people on this planet, almost as bad as the people who run the U.S. defense industry. Just really nasty people. There are a lot of indications that the Taliban might be a more savvy political actor than they used to be, might not be as horrific, but I think it's foolish of us to trust that. Certainly at this early date, it's entirely possible that we're going to see some really horrific ramifications for the people who aided our colonial project, for women and girls across Afghanistan. I should not minimize that. Also to the U.S. veterans who suffered and died, most often some of the poorest people in America, who in the United States, who were sold a bill of goods, told they were doing something worthwhile that would improve their life prospects. That thousands died and tens of thousands had their lives altered irrevocably by what they were forced to do by the U.S. government here for an utterly pointless aim. So I think it is appropriate to temper my joy at the end of this horrific nightmare by remembering what we've lost, what it has cost the Afghan people, what it has cost U.S. veterans. Yeah, I think that's some very important things to point out. All that said, I think it is, and this is going to seem strange. I actually had a buddy of mine. I was posting on Facebook, and a buddy of mine who works for the U.S. government was sort of like, "What? All of a sudden, you're a fan of U.S. presidents, Rob?" And yeah, in this case, yes. I'm not a fan of Biden. Last month's live chat was talking about how Biden was starving the people of Yemen just as Trump was. But I think that Joe Biden and even Donald Trump deserve real credit here, because what they have done is kind of heroic. I still can't apply that term to Donald Trump, but one of the most important, one of the wisest pieces of analysis I saw on Twitter over the past 3 days, and I have spent way too much time on Twitter over the past 3 days, was some guy named Jesse Walker who tweeted a sort of a hypothesis that nobody other than Donald Trump could have started this process of getting us out of Afghanistan, and nobody other than Joe Biden could have finished it. I think Biden is guilty of this. A lot of people are guilty of sort of blaming Trump for for this catastrophe or what have you, which I think is wrong on a number of levels. I don't think this is a catastrophe that we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 2 or 3 days. I think this is the end of a catastrophe. And the people talking the loudest about, oh, well, the problem is how this was done, are folks who had an interest in keeping the catastrophe going, quite frankly. Once again, there's real horror here. I mean, the images of Afghans falling off of planes is truly heartrending. Man, that rhyme with, people jumping off the World Trade Center is something that's going to stick with me forever. But what we're seeing here is the end of a catastrophe, and Donald Trump deserves the credit for being crazy enough to propose it. As we know from Donald Trump's sensibly crazy proposals on Syria, on Iraq, in Europe, around withdrawals of U.S. troops, he never had the power. He never had he was a deeply mentally disabled person. Actually, I don't know if that's unfair to mentally disabled people. He was not somebody who was what he was portrayed. He was never a competent executive. He was a phenomenal salesman. He was phenomenal at saying disruptive things. He was not someone who was capable of enacting any of his policies as president of the United States. But he was the only person who was crazy enough to look at $2 trillion worth of wasted U.S. expenditure and just say, hey, that's bullshit. We need to stop that. And Joe Biden, and this is pretty clearly documented, who was pretty cynical about the Afghan project, even back when he was Obama's vice president and was opposing the surge of troops into Afghanistan that did absolutely nothing. Was always cynical about this. But Biden, as we can see with Yemen, as we can see with the Iran nuclear deal, Biden is somebody who knows Washington, D.C. and, knows how to actually make things happen. But he's not somebody with the courage to actually end atrocities that the United States is committing. Yemen is still going. The Iran nuclear deal, something that would actually get the United States out of the Middle East and actually start the process of making Iran a normal country. Biden, it seems, doesn't have the courage to do that. But because Trump had already done the political costs and exerted, actually started the process of ending the war in Afghanistan, Biden, with his actual ability to run the U.S. government, was able to make it happen. And honestly, and I've said this on Twitter, and I thought people were laughing, if the Nobel Peace Prize committee wants to redeem itself from incredible jokes like giving Obama the Nobel Peace Prize right before he destroyed Libya and Syria, or giving Abiy Ahmed the Nobel Peace Prize before he launched the Ethiopian Civil War. If the Nobel Committee really wants to redeem itself, it should give a joint Nobel Peace Prize to Trump and Biden for ending this extraordinary atrocity that Washington, D.C. has foisted on the world. I ran one or two videos on Afghanistan, and one of them was sort of calling them, history's greatest waste. The U.S. Afghan project was history's greatest waste of time. There are things that have cost more. I think did the moonshot cost more than the U.S. war in Afghanistan? Did putting people on the moon cost more? I don't think it did. I don't think it did, actually. I'm not sure if it did, whether or not it did. World War I cost more, I think, in relative terms to countries like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Russian Empire, these places that destroyed. But those were wars. Those were things. Those were real. There were real issues that were contended. I mean, just imperial greed, but there were real issues there. The U.S. presence in Afghanistan, there's been nothing to it of any worth for 20 years, and it has cost $2 trillion. It was history's greatest waste. I do celebrate what Trump and Biden have done here. I do believe that Biden needs to be supported right now by the U.S. public against this onslaught of hatred that is coming his way from every supposedly, this bipartisan onslaught of hatred from U.S. media, U.S. contractors, U.S. defense industry that's coming to Biden. He does need to be protected from that. But I do think there were aspects of Biden's speech yesterday that were pretty horrifically off base. Biden's speech yesterday, to be clear, was a great speech, I think. I think it was clear. There were very few of his sort of standard stumbles anymore. I think it was clear. He said he's sticking to his guns. And I think that actually, just to be clear, I think what Biden is doing here requires real political courage, the kind of political courage that Donald Trump never had. He is sticking to his guns. He is sticking to his message. He is saying that the buck stops with him. He is not handing this catastrophe off to another president. And that is political courage. That is real political heroism. That said, the way that he characterized the U.S. project in Afghanistan was also a lie. This idea that, we did everything for the Afghans and they failed us. The more I think about it, the more insulting it gets. I linked a New York Times piece in the description from 2018 that is very, very instructive on this. You've got the Biden, you've got a lot of commentary in the United States right now that's talking about how Afghanistan failed us and how we gave so much to the Afghans, how we this, that, and the other thing. And those are transparent lies because these people should know better. There was some tweet that was it Ryan Grimm who said, someone had said, "Oh, we wasted $2 trillion." This guy said on Twitter, well, actually, most of that money just went straight to Northern Virginia. So I don't know what you're complaining about. We did not back the Afghan military in some unstinting way. We 100% did not spend trillions of dollars on the Afghan military. You have a lot of folks who say, well, we're building all these schools and whatnot in Afghanistan instead of building infrastructure in the United States. In that New York Times article, it's kind of shocking how little we actually spent on economic development in Afghanistan. I did some, research on this, probably pretty cursory, but it seems like the USAID, the largest aid agency in the world, The largest budget it ever had for Afghanistan was $1 billion a year. And don't get me wrong, $1 billion, that's a lot of money. But it was $1 billion a year, which means that USAID has spent less than $20 billion on actual economic development and support in Afghanistan. For reference, I just looked this up. The New York City subway system, the subway system in the city that I live in, costs $17 billion a year. Not to build it, just to operate it. Costs $17 billion a year. According to that New York Times article, the entire amount of money that we spent on Afghan economic development over the past 20 years was $24 billion. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric about, oh, we built all these schools and roads in Afghanistan for all this trillions of dollars. No, we spent trillions of dollars on death and destruction, on the U.S. military. Some of that money was on the U.S. military, the actual U.S. military people, what it takes to be there. On some of the calculations might include some of the VA spending. But the majority of the money we spent in Afghanistan was on bombs to drop on Afghanistan, on little tubes of explosives and microchips that we spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars giving to just a few companies in the United States. It's really crucial to emphasize this. The New York Times says $24 billion. That's what we spent on economic development in Afghanistan. What we spent, not just on the Afghan military that has been so pilloried by Joe Biden and other U.S. figures, what we spent on the entire Afghan military for 20 years. This is I guess it's only 17 years because the New York Times article in the description is from 2018, was $87 billion. Again, $87 billion is a lot of money, but that's not, so that's all told. You tot that up. Let's say that in the past 20 years, $200 billion of money filtered down to the Afghan people. And that's not even accurate because of that 200 billion, the lion's share of that money was probably going to the CEOs of humanitarian industrial complex contractors. So at the most, the money that went to the Afghan people was around $110 billion over the past 20 years. The vast majority of the $2 trillion we wasted in Afghanistan was just fire hosed into U.S. defense contractors, and even that $110 billion that went to Afghan stuff, a lot of that went to making the Afghan military buy military equipment they couldn't use. One of the most extraordinary new arguing points for the Washington, D.C. Warhawks this morning, this is something new that they're trying out. It's like Joe Biden, stabbed the Afghan military in the back because he wouldn't let the maintenance crews go in to service these Afghan planes. So Biden's this horrible, cruel person because he wouldn't let the U.S. contractors go into the Afghan Air Force bases to service the Afghan planes. Why did we sell the Afghans planes that could only be serviced by American techs? That's part of the money we gave Afghanistan. That's part of the money we gave Afghanistan. Part of the amazing gifts we gave to the Afghan military were planes that couldn't fly without a constant stream of more money being spent by the Afghan government going back to U.S. contractors. To be clear, this is a standard model. I mean, this is something that happens. I think someone claimed on Twitter when I made this argument that the German military has similar limitations, funnels money back to there's U.S. industry kickbacks with the German military because of this with the German military too. But yeah, it's the fucking Germans. They're never going to fight a war in my lifetime. the fact that in an open war zone, in a place where people like Joe Biden and everyone else in Washington, D.C. can talk about how much we've been doing for the Afghan military, we gave them military assets that were inoperable unless they had a government that was structured around sending billions and billions of dollars back to the United States. This was a grift. What was going on in Afghanistan for the past 20 years was one of the biggest scandals in human history. It was frankly disgusting. And the idea that people are going into, going in the national press today, talking about how we abandoned Afghan women and people after we've spent the past 20 years making hundreds of billions of dollars profiting off of a civil war that kills thousands of those Afghan women and girls is disgusting. I mean, let me be clear. Like, there were good things. There were good, pleasant things that were done in Afghanistan by the U.S. imperial occupation. There were schools being built for girls. I think a figure that I saw, don't take my word for it, was that in 2001 there were only 900,000 Afghan children in schools. Now there's something like 9 million. That is phenomenal. But like, what you have to understand is, like, this is like a rounding error of like what the actual war in Afghanistan was, what the actual U.S. imperial occupation was. Again, all of this, like the highest number by the New York Times accounting, the highest amount of money that you could plausibly imagine actually went to the Afghan people was something like $100 billion. And when you factor out all of the salaries of the Western do-gooders who were there, when you factor out all of that $100 billion that was meant to go back to paying U.S. defense contractors on top of the other hundreds of billions of dollars that when we're talking about the good things that were done in Afghanistan, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars of things. And the incredible thing is that if the relationship with the Taliban is carefully set up now, the prospects for humanitarian intervention in Afghanistan got dramatically better, have just gotten dramatically better, because there's not going to be a war. And that's the thing that has changed my view the most over the past 3 or 4 days, is the realization that after 40 years, like Afghanistan right now, under the Taliban, that sucks. But for 40 years, for the first time in 40 years, Afghanistan might really be at peace. That wasn't the plan. That wasn't the plan, even with Trump and Biden's plans to, like, screw it. We're gonna finally just shiv this thing and end it. The plan wasn't for Afghanistan to all of a sudden break out in peace, because that would be horrifically embarrassing for Washington, D.C. It would be horrifically embarrassing for the hawks in Washington, D.C., because the standard argument is like, oh, you're talking about forever wars. Well, don't you understand? These wars will just go on without us. You're being irresponsible. Yeah, maybe we can take the U.S. out, but when you take the U.S. out, the wars are going to continue forever. And U.S. policy was built very solidly around setting up that idea in Afghanistan. Nobody thought the Taliban would be defeated. And certainly nobody thought that the Taliban would be defeated better without U.S. troops there. No, the plan was for the war to continue forever, to support this idea that, see, nothing gets better when the U.S. leaves. It is a tremendous victory against the war hawks if what we seem to be beginning to see today is what happens. If the U.S. withdrawal happens and it instantly means the end of a 40-year-old civil war, that is very clarifying. And I think that's the thing that people in Washington, D.C. find most horrifying and most terrifying about what happened over the past 3 days. The possibility that we're going to have this 20-year mess that could just solve itself the second the U.S. leaves, I think is a pretty clear indicator and a pretty clear demolishing of one of the greatest pieces of war hawk propaganda, this idea that, oh, when you take the US out of these wars, they're going to get worse. Well, it seems like even before the United States left, the war in Afghanistan is over. That's amazing, frankly. And Washington, D.C. is already working really, really, really hard. Already working really, really hard to screw that up. I think I've seen just in tweets, but it looks like, Ahmad Shah Massoud's kid and some other warlord, they've already set up a government in exile in Uzbekistan or some shit. There's, Ashraf Ghani, the guy who's cowardice, the president of the defeated U.S. occupation government, have fled the country. Who knows? He could try to constitute some kind of thing. I really, really hope that we don't let. I really, really, really hope that we don't let the U.S. government do that, because I know for sure Washington, D.C. right now, they're like, okay, so can we do the Yemen plan? Can we do the Syria plan? How can we make Afghanistan as miserable as possible? There's a lot of people talking about, Afghan women and girls. And what they're doing for Afghan women and girls is they are devising a sanctions program that will crush Afghanistan into nothing. That's what they're going to do for Afghan women and girls. If we really want to help Afghan women and girls, we have a tremendous number of levers that we can pull. I was unhappy to see that we're already holding the funds of the Afghan central bank hostage. The Taliban is the government of Afghanistan, quite clearly. In a just world, they would be given the funds of the Afghan central bank to do with as they can to attempt to rebuild the country. We're not going to do that. What I think the Washington, D.C. is probably going to do is an aspect of the Yemen plan, which is over the next week or so, construct some kind of, Yemeni government level farce out of Ashraf Ghani, the fled president, other warlords who are living in exile, try to call that the real government, and try to set up some kind of insurgency. That's a good way to kill a lot of Afghan women and girls, and crush Afghanistan for another 20 years. That's a good way to do those things. What we should do with those Afghan central bank funds is we should say, okay, well, you've won, Taliban. Let's negotiate. I don't think the U.S. can just dictate this. I think in Doha, the U.S. government should sit down with the Taliban representatives in Doha and set out what is the status of Afghan women that is acceptable to the Taliban, but does have a level of possibility. How do we make sure that funds can still reach women's education? How do we make sure that women are given some say in the Taliban government? Something that the Taliban, to be clear, seems amenable to in these first days of its new ruling. That's what we should do. We should set up, negotiated in Doha, the release of these central bank funds to the Taliban over the next series of years in return for hitting certain points that the Taliban has agreed to hit when it comes to women's rights and preservation. And the thing is, the main obstruction to rights of women in Afghanistan has not been the fucking Taliban. The fucking Taliban controlled Afghanistan for like 4 years, from like 1997 until 2001. And even in like that 1997 to 2001 period, there are tons of well-documented stories of them negotiating with U.S. oil companies, them negotiating this, that, and the other freaking thing. I think it's pretty clear that if the Bush administration had any real interest in avoiding a war in Afghanistan, they would have been happy to hand us Osama bin Laden in chains in return for some development money. The main obstruction to women's rights in Afghanistan has not been the fucking Taliban. It has been war. The Kabul, which I think it's sort of extraordinary urban history I've been diving into. I think under the Soviets, Kabul was 2 million people. And then in the horrific wars after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, Kabul went from like 2 million people to like 500,000 people. And now under the US occupation, it's gone from 500,000 people to 6 million people, apparently. I mean, those numbers, this is just looked at glancingly on Twitter. They could be widely inaccurate, but it's true that there's been certainly a hockey stick growth of the population of Kabul. In Kabul, and perhaps a few other provincial capitals, the quality of life of a certain class, a certain economic class of Afghan women has been better probably than it has been at any point in Afghan history, because of the horrific civil war that the United States has eagerly maintained in Afghanistan for 20 years. The rest, the other 33, so the other 16 million, so let's say half of, so say maybe 3 million Afghan women were given a better life under the US occupation. The other 16 million Afghan women were left at the complete mercy of whatever drug smuggling, warlording, barely literate but super, Islamically literate, supposedly thug. The vast majority of Afghan women under the U.S. occupation have been at the complete mercy of whatever warlord ran their province. Under the Taliban, a bunch of fellows who admittedly have some pretty bad ideas about things, at least there won't be war. And the Taliban, even if the U.S. is as dumb, the U.S. government is as dumb as it always is and tries to set up like a Yemen strategy here with some kind of, completely illegitimate fugitive government that gets to control the central bank, even if that happens, which is very likely because Washington, D.C. is a bunch of assholes. Even if that happens, which is likely, the Taliban is still going to be interested in humanitarian money and humanitarian development money, and it's actually going to control the country. What is horrible for human rights, this is something that Washington, D.C. will never tell you, the worst thing for human rights is war. The Holocaust, horrible thing that Hitler always wanted to do. You know what allowed Hitler to do the Holocaust? War. Washington, D.C. loves war. And Afghanistan without war and with the Taliban is actually a vastly better Afghanistan, a place where human rights are going to be vastly safer than an Afghanistan with the Taliban and peace is a vastly safer place where humanitarian rights are vastly more likely to flourish than the Afghanistan that Washington, D.C. was envisioning a week ago, which was a never-ending civil war between, the U.S. occupying government and the Taliban. That's a really crucial point that Washington, D.C. wants to hide from you everywhere on the planet. I think the Yemen parallel, I've been meaning to do a video. I've been meaning to do a video for a while talking about how Yemen is the future, because we're not going to see a lot of wars like Afghanistan again. We're not going to see a lot of wars where we actually see U.S. boots on the ground, because that's the main thing. That what we are going to see is a lot of U.S. special forces on the ground. What we are going to see is a lot of U.S. killer robots on the ground, and they're going to support horseshit stuff like we're supporting in Yemen. Like what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen is an imperial invasion, just as straightforward as anything the British Empire did. It's almost exactly what Saddam Hussein did to Kuwait. It is a rich neighbor picking on a poor neighbor. However, there's enough of a bullshit factory in Washington, D.C. that it can be portrayed as like, oh, it's part of this amazing battle between Sunni and Shia that wouldn't exist if the U.S. wasn't occupying all these countries, by the way. But, it's between the Sunnis and the Shias. So, like, we've got some kind of plausible reason to be there. So the war can just go on forever. That is exactly, and because there aren't any U.S. soldiers dying, the U.S. public doesn't give a shit. And it's just like, fine, keep going. shovel trillions of dollars to the defense industry. We don't care. We don't even notice. That's exactly what we were likely to get in Yemen after the U.S. left. Sorry, that was exactly what we were likely to get in Afghanistan after the U.S. left. We were likely to get a Yemen-style thing. In Yemen, there's the internationally recognized government, which has been the internationally recognized government of Yemen has been in Saudi Arabia like the entire time. And if the Afghan government hadn't collapsed, the U.S. occupation Afghan government hadn't collapsed so spectacularly over the past week or so, that's exactly what we would have had in Yemen, except it would have actually looked more legitimate. So that's exactly what we would have had in Afghanistan, except it would have looked more legitimate than what we have set up in Yemen. And it is a tremendous gift to the Afghan people that they are not going to be experiencing, the Yemen model in this strong version. I think what's quite possible and quite likely is that we're going to see a sort of weak version of the Yemen plan applied to Afghanistan. Ashraf Ghani or whatever warlords we can find to set up in Tajikistan and give them all the central bank's funds. To be clear, that's one of the main things that Hadi has. Hadi has Yemen's fake president. Hadi has control of the oil resources because they're out in the desert and Saudi Arabia can control that for him. This is in Yemen. And he also has control of the central bank because the world financial system is, basically the United States, and they decided to give him the central bank. I think there's a real danger that that'll happen in Afghanistan as well. I'm going to guard against that, but I really think Afghanistan kind of dodged the bullet. For now, for today, for this week, it seems like Afghanistan is at peace. To be clear, that's the incredibly optimistic interpretation, and I'll probably get in trouble for advancing it in tweets because it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that the Taliban. Well, what's very likely actually is that the U.S. is going to find some way to bomb the Taliban or kill a bunch of Taliban people, and then the Taliban's going to be like, "Oh, fuck me, well, fuck you," and it's going to crush the rights of women and start doing massive reprisal killings. And that is very much within the possibility. That's very possibly going to be the Taliban playbook. It's entirely possible that the United States will be very successful in setting up a new Northern Alliance to send Afghanistan plummeting back into civil war. Any number of horrible things could happen. But today, it looks like there's a real, I honestly, I think today, I think there are more reasons to be optimistic about Afghanistan than there have been in 20 years. And that is my place. That is, here I stand, I can do no other. To be clear, and I should have started off with this. I meant to, I got this very wrong. I ran an Afghanistan video like 2 months ago, and I said, we're going to be in Afghanistan as long as I'm alive. I was pretty sure that Trump and Biden were our last chance to get out of Afghanistan. I was pretty sure that, you've already seen all the great power competition nonsense that Washington, D.C. has been pushing so hard for the past 3 years. It was just a matter of time before, some asshole in the Pentagon Public Relations Department looked at the map and said, look, Afghanistan's on the border with China. We're giving up on great power competition if we let it go, or whatever. And that was going to become like ironclad and never to be gone. So, Biden really impressed me. I think I do have to say that Joe Biden really impressed me. I thought there would be a chance of real progress on the Iran nuclear deal and on Yemen. I'm not seeing that real progress, but the end to the war in Afghanistan is just extraordinary because it was one of the biggest money spinners. It's amazing that it was of no importance to most of the U.S. public, especially once U.S. soldiers started dying, but stopped dying. But it was of incredible importance to the Washington, D.C., the whole military-industrial complex, just the amount of money that was just constantly spinning around in there because of Afghanistan. And it's pretty extraordinary that it ended, that Biden was was man enough to sort of put down his foot and end it. It's pretty extraordinary. And yeah, I see my brother is in there complaining about how it's quite possible that it's quite possible that the Taliban and the U.S. military will get into it, and we will end up piling back another 5,000-10,000 troops and just keep on going. Yeah, that's entirely possible, but as of today, it doesn't look likely. I think the Taliban. This is the first real test of the Taliban government of Afghanistan, is the ability to get every single American out of Afghanistan completely unscathed. Because I think it's instructive to remember that it took one dead American journalist to create a completely illegal multi-billion-dollar U.S. occupation of Syria that nobody in the United States had any interest in. Like, we have an occupation of Syria because one American journalist was killed. And I think the Taliban sees that and knows that if they let some crazy guy who's pissed in Kabul kill a bunch of U.S. soldiers, then yeah, it's all of this progress could be discarded. Biden could be forced to keep this $2 trillion nightmare going on for another decade, another $1 trillion. That's true. That's a very good point. It's entirely possible that it is entirely possible that this will all fall apart and we'll be right back to the status quo. That is definitely what Washington, D.C. wants more than anything else right now. And I really hope it doesn't happen. Let's see. But yeah, I was very wrong. I did not anticipate that Joe Biden would be this heroic, frankly, that he would be willing to do such a solid for the American and the Afghan people. I did not see that in Joe Biden's character. I wish he would do the same when it came to the Iran nuclear deal in Yemen, but this was actually a bigger thing. Like, I thought this was just going to be part of the background of American life for the rest of the century. And it is a tremendous gift that Joe Biden has given to this country and to the world and to the Afghan people that's not the case. Hopefully it could all fall apart. As far as like what to do going forward, I get a lot of critiques that say I don't talk about that. I think there are 3 steps that the U.S. government should absolutely take, and the U.S. public should insist that the U.S. government take. The first step is the auditing of the Defense Department. They attempted to do this. Just a simple, basic accounting. One of the extraordinary things about the Afghan atrocity is we don't have any idea how much money we spent on this. The New York Times article, everybody else's attempts are just guesses. And the really horrifying thing, the Pentagon's attempts to say how much money was spent here are just guesses. Every other department of the U.S. government is required to account for where all the money goes down to the last penny, to a point that can often seem, ridiculous. But that's good. We should know where taxpayer dollars are spent. The Department of Defense, nope, does not have to account for itself. There was famously an audit attempt, I think in the past 3 or 4 years, and we basically, the Congress had hearings. Basically, the audit failed. We just could not figure out where and when the Defense Department was spending money. That is something, after this extraordinary failure in Afghanistan, I think that is something that we cannot allow to continue. The Defense Department must be audited. That's the first thing. Second, I think that the House Foreign Affairs Committee is probably a good place for this. I'd love to see Ilhan Omar leading this. There should be months-long hearings calling to account every single one of the contractors that made billions and billions of dollars off of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I was talking about putting these people in jail. That's not going to happen. But we do need to talk about, we need to humiliate these companies. We need to make it clear to the U.S. public where this money is going. I think there needs to be all manner of, House hearings, whatnot, talking about not just the Afghan debacle, but the rest of this horror show that has been the war on terror. And most importantly, is something that's already been written, something that already has tripartisan support. Bernie Sanders, of independent socialist fame, Mike Lee, a very hardcore conservative Republican, and Chris Murphy, my erstwhile senator from Connecticut, a sort of standard boring ass liberal Democrat, have already written and put together a new War Powers Act. This is a sweeping act that gives Congress not just oversight over ongoing military commitments, but also oversight over who we sell weapons to. This is an extraordinarily sweeping piece of legislation. It is already written. It is supported and championed by one of the most popular and trusted political figures of the century, Bernie Sanders. All that's really necessary now is for the U.S. public to get behind it, and I can't think of a better launching pad for this new Congressional War Powers Act than this catastrophe in Afghanistan. I think people will point out, well, Congress gave the executive a blank check with the authorization for the use of military force in the aftermath of 9/11. Yes, that's very true, and that was clearly a terrible misstep. And nobody other than Barbara Lee, the one extraordinarily brave Congresswoman who said this is a terrible idea and it's going to lead to terrible things, comes out of the weeks after 9/11 looking, intelligent or restrained. But the amazing thing about putting Congress in charge of these aspects of foreign policy is not the idea that they're wise or the idea that they're somehow more trustworthy than the executive branch. What the Congress is timid. What the Congress is a bunch of scaredy cats who don't want to put their name on anything that might fail. Whereas a president, has the benefit of, I look tough, so I'm going to go do this thing, and it's one decision actor. In a Congress and without a 9/11, if we give Congress the power over war again, as they are supposed to have in the Constitution, we just won't go to war anymore. This isn't like a theory. This is something that actually happened. Obama didn't really want to go into Syria, so he said, well, I'll go into Syria if the Congress authorizes me to do it. And Congress did not. And that is a tremendously happy eventuality. Unfortunately, we couldn't save Syria from the CIA. We couldn't save Syria from the humanitarian industrial complex that is still allied with Al Qaeda in Idlib in Syria. But we did keep the United States out of it, and the Syrian government survived. We can actually keep the United States from getting into war if we give the powers back to the Congress that they should have in the Constitution. This is a piece of legislation that isn't, off in the ether somewhere. This is a piece of legislation that is already written, is supported by Bernie Sanders, as well as a Republican and a Democrat. And if anybody can look at the catastrophe over the past week in Afghanistan and think to themselves that, things are going fine, we shouldn't change war powers that much, they are absolutely out of their minds. All right. Well, that is my presentation, 50 minutes. I hope that was worthwhile. Have we got any questions? I will go through. James SR23 says, Ron Paul should be given a Nobel Peace Prize for warning us of these entanglements. Did Ron Paul vote against the authorization for the use of military force in 2001? I don't think he did. I think Barbara Lee did. I think Barbara Lee obviously should have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize a long time ago. Will this lead to America turning his attention to South America? Now that's a terrifying possibility. I think what's really important now, that's why I think those hearings in the House are really important. That's why I think the defense industry audit is really important. I think it's really important that we blame the people who are responsible for this nightmare. Like, is there a distinct chance that, all of the sort of evils of the military-industrial complex propaganda machine no longer being focused on Afghanistan? Does that mean they're going to swing towards Venezuela? Does that mean they're going to swing towards Cuba? Yeah, there's a real possibility of that. This freeing up of all these resources, does that mean that the United States is going to haul off and invade somewhere else? Yeah, that's definitely a really distinct possibility. I would hope that these images at the Afghan airport indicate just how foolhardy that would be. And that's why I think it's really important that we don't just let the lessons slide away here. Vigermain says, do you think the talks with the Taliban are legit? And what do you think the Taliban want from the talks? Which countries do you think will support the Taliban economically and militarily? Honestly, I think the U.S. should support the Taliban economically and militarily, because if we do so, then we can get things in return, like some protection of rights for women. I think the United States owes the Afghan government and the Afghan people extraordinary reparations. I think we actually should pour some real money into rebuilding Afghanistan now that the Taliban have brought peace. That's what I think should happen. It's probably not what's going to happen, but that's what should happen. A lot of people are talking about how, Pakistan, the Pakistanis are the big winners here. They got everything they wanted out of this. No, the Pakistanis are fucking terrified. They really should be. Over the past 20 years, to maintain this extraordinary $1 trillion grift, to continue this extraordinary level of corruption with U.S. defense contractors, the U.S. government turned a really blind eye to Pakistan's, protection of Osama bin Laden, support of the Taliban, the fact that they're probably the country most responsible for nuclear proliferation to North Korea. Also the fact that they've been playing footsie with China. Pakistan's whole foreign policy, their ability to be like, we're a friend of the United States, we're a friend of China, was completely reliant on the U.S. continuing its $1 trillion grift in Afghanistan. With the end of that $1 trillion grift, like, Pakistan's in some real trouble, honestly. I think it's pretty well established that Pakistan already has some pretty strong ties with the Taliban. If they can set themselves up as a sensible intermediary between the United States and the Taliban, or the world community and the Taliban, then maybe that's a way to preserve some usefulness. But, I think Pakistan's in some serious trouble because of the very surprising end of this grift. The more I think about it, this is a serious geopolitical shift that works entirely to the U.S.'s advantage, which is not something you're going to hear out of Washington, D.C. very much, because it does not work to Washington, D.C.'s advantage. Local Extreme asks, could a future U.S. president reverse this decision by reinvading Afghanistan? Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. We'd need a really big terrorist attack in the U.S. We'd need something else, but that can be arranged. I think there's a lot of people who talk about, Al-Qaeda resurgence off of this, and they're full of shit. The United States has been working closely with Al-Qaeda in Syria for 10 years now. The Public Broadcasting Corporation in the United States, PBS, Public Broadcasting Stations. What is PBS? Whatever. The U.S. version of the BBC, which is obviously very cheap, and a fraction is important because we don't like government stuff here in the U.S. PBS Frontline, in the past 6 months ran a friendly documentary about the Al-Qaeda leader of the Syrian resistance to Assad. So people were talking about there's going to be terrorism again because of the Taliban thing, are just absolutely full of shit. But I am of the opinion that in this, and I've run videos saying as much, in this oil market, this new sort of oil environment, the Gulf allies that we had that were happy to use their, and also added to that, I think there are elements. Why is my connection unstable? Well, hopefully we're still going. Are we still there? Are we still there? I'm just going to keep, why? Are we still here? Okay, looks like we might be back. So not only have the Gulf people run out of money to fund international terrorism, I think international terrorism is just sort of going out of style. It was just so stupid looking in Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State, a U.S. proxy that got out of hand, embarrassed itself. It sort of did this big thing, we're the new caliphate, we take over all this land, and then it's gone. I think more and more people are recognizing in the Arab world that the Arab Spring was this incredible opportunity. There was this incredible opportunity that the Arab world had, and that the Gulf states funded a bunch of crazy jihadists who, along with the United States, ended that opportunity of the Arab Spring. So I kind of feel like the whole terrorism thing is going to switch and morph. I think that the whole terrorism thing, the Islamic terrorism thing, already it's not a factor in world politics the way it was 5 years ago. It's just something that just doesn't matter anymore. One of the really fascinating things is that around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, in the late 1900s and the early 20th century, we had an international sort of anarcho-communist terrorist threat. It was a real thing. It assassinated a U.S. president, a couple Russian czars, really a huge terrorist threat. It was, if you read novels of that time, it was sort of an all-present thing that people were worried about. And then it just sort of faded away, I mean, faded away with World War I, to be honest. But it went away. And I feel like this whole threat of Islamic terrorism is something that is also in the process of just fading away. Even with Afghanistan back in the control of the Taliban, because I think the Taliban has certainly realized that, well, actually harboring Osama bin Laden, we won eventually, but 20 years of this wasn't the greatest, and maybe harboring Osama bin Laden wasn't the best thing to have happened. Do we have questions? I see no super chats today, huh? Even with 140 people here? Huh? Anyway, let's see. So we're good. We are connected. I'm infuriated that there was some difficulty with the connection because I have an Ethernet cable. I am jacked directly into the modem. Anyway, I apologize for that. Ricky, could the Taliban want to expand once it secures its dominance within Afghanistan? I don't find that particularly credible. I think a really underappreciated aspect, and this is something I got chatting with a friend of mine who's a veteran over the past weekend, was just like it's really underappreciated how little of Afghanistan was ever really under anybody's centralized control. And the way that it actually got worse. The first decade of the U.S. in Afghanistan kind of looked like, maybe things are okay because the U.S. just sort of held a few big cities. It was when they actually tried to go out and control the countryside that the civil war really picked up in a massive way. So I think that the Taliban is going to have extraordinary difficulty just knitting together this incredibly complex place. And any government of Afghanistan is not any government of Afghanistan is not going to be like, the basis of like some kind of centralized emirate that's going to go over and take over everything. It's just an ongoing negotiation. That's what any centralized government of Afghanistan is going to be. And the idea that Taliban is gonna somehow expand into its neighbors seems like really, really hard to credit. They're not going to expand into China, though I wouldn't be surprised if within the next 20 years the U.S. was funding them to try to do it. But their expansion into Pakistan, I think, is an ongoing thing. I think that's another real problem for Pakistan, because Pakistan already has a large ungoverned sector. So Pakistan, might have some real trouble with that. But the idea that like Afghanistan's going to launch into any of the Soviet stands, like what exactly does the Taliban have to offer these folks? I feel like not much. I mean, who knows? Maybe, you know, a free Taliban Islamic Emirate will just, you know, blow everybody's mind and become a, you know, the Wakanda of the Hindu, not the Hindu Kush, the Wakanda of Central Asia. I would find that, unlikely. So I don't see the prospect of the Taliban like expanding in some kind of that's the kind of fantasy bullshit that Washington D.C. has been selling for quite some time, but it doesn't seem credible to me. I like that, the Wakanda of the fundamentalist Wakanda of Central Asia. Yeah, I don't see it. Does America still have a massive embassy in Afghanistan? My understanding is we have abandoned a massive embassy in Afghanistan. I think a $1 billion embassy, which is another great example of, you know, $1 billion. That's what we spent on that fucking U.S. embassy in Kabul is around a 20th of all of the development money we spent on the Afghan people in 20 years. That is a tremendously valuable symbol of how little we actually cared about the people of Afghanistan and how much we cared about U.S. empire in Afghanistan. It's very similar, actually. I think, isn't the Indian government still headquartered in Government House, which was the extraordinarily opulent palace of the viceroy in British India? It's, you know, yeah, I don't think I emphasize that enough. Like what we did in Afghanistan was colonization. It was really like gross old school imperial bullshit. And the fact that our government evaporated the second we left is underlining just how gross that was. What we need to do by transferring war powers back to the Congress is to ensure that this kind of imperial bullshit can never happen again. I mean, this shit makes the United States weaker. The United States has such an extraordinary well of power, from our financial dominance to our tech dominance to, I don't want to go all Peter Zeihan here, but just the incredible core of independent economic value and power that you have in the United States, you know, with an ocean on either side, non-threats on top of us, river systems that go everywhere. Like the United States has such incredible power. And the usage, and yes, our dominant military force is worth preserving. I do believe, I'm not someone who thinks that if the U.S. military just disappeared, you know, the world would be all happiness and kumbaya. I do think if the U.S. closed the majority of its bases, the world would be more happiness and kumbaya. The U.S.'s incredible military power is vastly more valuable as a threat. When the U.S. military power is used, as it has been in Afghanistan, as it has been in Iraq and Syria, it undermines the value and power of the United States extraordinarily. It makes the United States weaker. This extraordinary, embarrassing grift we've done in Afghanistan has done nothing to make the U.S. more secure and more powerful. It has made us weaker. Our presence in Iraq and Syria makes us look like some dipshit, piece of shit, 19th century British or French dipshit in a pith helmet running around going, oh, look at me, I'd like to kill the brown people. That's what that shit makes us look like. The United States is infinitely better than us, infinitely better than some shitty British Empire, French Empire, racist, murdering fuck. And Washington, D.C., because it wants to make billions of dollars, turns poor American kids into racist, murdering fucks. So U.S. military is worth preserving as a threat. When the U.S. military is used, it makes the United States weaker. And I think by putting these powers back to the U.S. Congress, we can actually become what the United States has the power to be, is to actually be a positive force in the world. Using military force makes the United States weaker. It makes us petty, and it turns us into the villains. Sorry. and got a little exercise there. I apologize. Does America still have a massive embassy in Afghanistan? Yes. Sorry, I answered that one. Nikhil Attar says, how do you factor in the degradation of women's rights into how good it was to get America out? Long term, will they suffer more because of the Taliban? My answer to that would be which Afghan women? I think I talked earlier about how I talked earlier about how in Kabul and some provincial capitals, we built schools for women. It was fantastic. But we were never going to be able to reach into the parts of Afghanistan where the majority of Afghans live because of this civil war that was our main goal in maintaining in Afghanistan. The Taliban can reach into all these villages in a more serious way and with more legitimacy. I am not joking. I don't think I'm being unserious when I say that the Taliban can be a greater force for women's uplifting and enrichment than the United States, than the pennies that fell off our missile trucks were for Afghan women and girls. I think that the Taliban actually has control of Afghanistan in a way that the United States never did. So while I think it's absolutely true, there will be horrible images in the coming weeks. We will see, I don't know what we're going to see out of the Taliban. They're talking a good name now, but I think there's a distinct chance we'll get real horror shows. We'll get real, really nasty images and really nasty things being done to women and girls in Afghanistan. But what I think is really important, if you get like a serious, what I think is more important to work out for is like, okay, so every girls' school in Helmand province was closed. Are there any girls' schools in Helmand province? Was closed. That's an interesting story. In this village here, this woman, this 14-year-old was given to a Taliban soldier as a bride. Okay, like, wasn't that already happening? Wasn't that already happening with our warlords in Afghan villages? I think we need to be very careful in the coming weeks about how we treat that. We're going to see a lot of horrible, sensational stories. I'm sure most of which will have elements of truth. But like what I haven't seen a lot of substantive reporting on is like, how far did our reach go? Like, which Afghan women and girls were we reaching under the U.S. occupation? As a side effect of the civil war we were maintaining. But like, why don't I answer this question honestly? Like, if the most horrific fantasies of the most, concocted by the most Raytheon bribed NGO, nonprofit in Washington, D.C. come true, if, everything goes back to 1997 immediately, every woman is pushed out of school, if it becomes the worst version of the nightmare, do I think it is still better for the United States to be out of there? 100%. 100%. Because the long-term cost of the U.S. bringing this colonial model to the rest of the world is much, much worse than horrors that may be endured by Afghan women. And to be clear, I think that if Washington, D.C. allows what has happened in Afghanistan, the end of 40 years of war in Afghanistan, if we allow that to continue, I think the prospects for the rights and prospects of women and girls in Afghanistan actually just improve dramatically. If the war is allowed, if DC allows the war to end, which is a huge if. And yes, I do say with full cognizance that this could be exactly the horror show that folks are worried about it being. It could be, and even if it is exactly the horror show, the true, not just anecdotal here and there, but the true broad-based horror show for Afghan women and girls, yes, because it is a greater evil in my mind for the United States to attempt to force our way of looking at the world through bullets and guns on the world than for Afghanistan to have treat its women and girls horribly. I think it is far worse to do a colonial project than it is for horrible things to happen. And I think things might actually get better for women and girls in Afghanistan if the war is over. There was a super chat I had missed in there. Generic Satyam. Is a comeback from some faction of the Afghan government possible in the next 3 years? I fucking hope not. I mean, what about these guys says come back? My understanding is that there are serious... I don't know if this is true, if this is just Pentagon bullshit. The 300,000, which I think even Biden might have quoted the 300,000 Afghan troops. Apparently 2/3 of that 300,000 Afghan troops were ghost soldiers. This is something you see across Africa, mostly in terms of counterterrorism. U.S. provides counterterrorism money. Some Sahel despot sets up a counterterror force where 1/3 or 2/3 of the soldiers don't exist because the despot is just pocketing the salaries. So apparently 2/3 of the 300,000 Afghan army were ghost soldiers, which were people that didn't exist because the generals or warlords were just pocketing the money. And then of the other 100,000, few of them were being paid. Supposedly, there are serious Afghan special forces that exist that actually have real skills and abilities. And I think it's a very interesting question what those guys are going to do. I think a lot of them have just sort of faded away into the population. I think what those guys do a lot depends on how the Taliban handles the next couple months. It's funny, like it's a lot like de-Baathification. In fact, if these special forces are as competent as the Pentagon claimed, which is, believing in Pentagon claims is obviously has been proven to be a pretty silly thing to do, but it seems credible. Maybe, I don't know. Then yeah, like maybe those those folks will be the genesis of an insurgency. I certainly know that there are people in Washington D.C. who are working on that already. Who knows? It would be, but for sure, like the Afghan special forces would be the nucleus of any kind of resistance to the Taliban rule. We'll see how that goes. Questions. Local Cool Extreme. What's your take on pundits and people like Alt History Hub who suggest this is a massive win for China? How? How would this be a big win for China? Getting the United States out of the region is, probably good. Yeah, I mean, I guess, China would be happy to not have the U.S. military occupying its border anymore. One incredibly positive thing here is like possibly this will help convince the Chinese government to back off cultural genocide against the Uyghurs. One of the great unspoken things about their prosecution of the Uyghurs. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the Chinese, it's a communist totalitarian state. Persecuting potential sources of dissent is what they do. But I think that the Uyghurs of Xinjiang probably seem like a much less plausible source of dissent and problems now that the United States is no longer has a client state on the Chinese border. So yeah, I mean, massive win for China. I mean, Pakistan is now like, China has now basically, they had already like bought Pakistan, but like Pakistan was still like the stability of Pakistan was still something that the US and the UK and NATO cared really deeply about. Now we don't. Like, I mean, obviously everybody in the world cares about the stability of Pakistan because they have fucking nukes, but like, day to day, we don't need much from Pakistan other than for it to not fall apart. Whereas like China has made this extraordinary investment. The Belt and I've talked about this before. The Belt and Road is mostly the Belt and Road project, China's big industrial project across Asia and into Europe, is mostly bullshit. It's sort of a public relations exercise that I think most people within China and without have conceded has kind of backfired in a lot of places. And, it has built some useful infrastructure in some places for sure, but has also occasioned a lot of ill will and caused problems as well. Most of the Belt and Road Initiative, no matter what the DC Hawks tell you, is like kind of a backfired mess and never was that significant. The Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan is tremendously significant. If you look at, so much of the horror that China is carrying out in Xinjiang province is about creating a back door that goes through Pakistan. $70 billion from China, which is a significant amount of money from China, has been poured into Pakistan, into development of infrastructure, making that place run. Unfortunately, the Chinese appear to be just as hated in Pakistan by the man on the street as they are everywhere else they go. So it's already a massive, massive investment, one of the biggest foreign investments by China into Pakistan. And now nobody else in the world cares about keeping Afghanistan and Pakistan stable. I don't see that as a victory for China. I see that as an extraordinary headache that has been dropped in China's lap and has been taken off the U.S. balance sheet. So yeah, I guess China won. I don't know. I can clip that exactly, can't I? Yes, I can. I can totally make that into another little video, can't I? Well, Daxton Min couldn't agree more, and I am very grateful for that. There was another chat. Boss, opinion on Turkey wanting to control Kabul airport for the U.S. and NATO. I don't know. How does that look? This was a huge story a couple days back, like a week or two back. So Turkey wants to control the Kabul airport for the U.S. and NATO, and this was a huge political. This was a huge. Thank you, boss, for bringing this up. That was a huge geopolitical question. What is Erdogan's interest in this? What is Turkey's interest in this? Will they be able to do this? Will the, no. I don't think that's a real open question anymore. Turkey was going to control and secure the Kabul airport under the auspices of the U.S. occupation Afghan government. The U.S. occupation Afghan government is gone. I think the Taliban is going to be controlling the Kabul airport, and it'll be probably vastly more secure. I think that's one of the. I really, really think people are understating the incredible value of the war being over, even if the Taliban won. You won't have to. I've read conflicting stuff on this, and only on Twitter. But my understanding is apparently the U.S. embassy, the standard way to get to the airport was by helicopter, because ground transportation for the U.S. embassy wasn't secure, even in Kabul, or something. I don't know if that's completely true, but you're not going to need a foreign power to make a real commitment to secure the Kabul airport if the war is over. You're not going to need serious military forces at the airport, conceivably. I'm sure, once again, the U.S. is going to find somebody to back and make the war an ongoing thing. But thank you, boss, for bringing that up, because that's just really an indication of 2 weeks ago, I'd be I should really write a video on, what it's going to mean for Turkey to control the Kabul airport. Should they do it? Should they not do it? That's a pretty moot point now. The Taliban's going to control the Kabul airport. There's not going to be a battle for the Kabul airport. There's not going to be a battle for Kabul, which is another thing. That was one of the horrific battles for Kabul that took the Kabul population from 2 million down to 500,000. Now, it's not 1.5 million people were killed in Kabul, but 1.5 million people left Kabul over the horrific series of wars between the U.S. proxies and the Soviet government, then between the U.S. proxies against each other, and then between the warlords that had won and the Taliban. We missed that. The Kabul airport doesn't need super special security, unless, of course, the Afghan special forces and Ahmad Shah Massoud's kid or Ashraf Ghani, put together some kind of insurgent force that attacks, the Kabul airport. Kind of crazy how much has changed, how quickly. Dunny Egg says, how do you think all this will turn out for Biden at the end, like a year later or re-election? Unfortunately, I think this is phenomenal. I think this should be the centerpiece of Biden's re-election campaign. He took us out of Afghanistan. He finally ended that nightmare. I don't think anybody in the U.S. cares one way or the other. People are like, oh, he's never going to run for re-election now. He'll never live down this horrible mistake. It's like, I don't think anybody's going to care in 2024. I'm more like, is he going to live to 2024? I got to say, Biden looked great yesterday. I think Biden looked more together and coherent yesterday than he has in any of his public appearances in the campaign or afterwards. I think he believes very clearly in what he's done in Afghanistan. I think he's right to believe very clearly in what he's done, and is getting out. And I think that's a phenomenal thing. But I don't know, man. Like 2024 is still a long way off. I think the chances of Afghanistan mattering much to that election are pretty slim. Ali Razi asks, will countries recognize Taliban as legitimate government of Afghanistan? No. I think Pakistan will fairly quickly if it hasn't already. Maybe some other countries. I think the key question here is the U.S. is going to be too much of a sore loser to recognize for a while. I mean, look, Assad won the war in Syria 3 or 4 years ago, and only now are other Arab countries beginning to be like, hey, time to concede this point and start dealing with Assad again. What's interesting is just how total the Taliban's victory appears to be at this point. I mean, it is complete so far until, probably by next week, we'll have some insurgency has emerged in some corner. Washington, D.C. is working very hard to make it so that insurgency is coalescing, I'm sure. But, their victory has been so complete. I think the crucial distinction isn't recognition, which I'm sure will take the United States a long time to do, and all of our vassal states will take a long time for them to do that as well. The crucial question is interaction. It doesn't, we don't have to do like the full-on diplomatic recognition and like we do have to remove sanctions against people who are now the government of Afghanistan. We have to. The crucial question is, are we going to continue talking to the Taliban? And that's something we must do, for the Afghan people, for Afghan women and girls, for the former supporters of the United States who are still in Afghanistan. If we care about any of these people at all, we must talk to the Taliban. So that's the more important question. As far as like full-on diplomatic recognition, I think that's going to take a while outside of like a few countries. Pakistan, maybe China. Did I see something about China, being fairly quick about that? But yeah, like the actual recognition seems unlikely, but talking is what's important. The various people in Afghanistan are more ethnically and linguistically Persian. So sorry, this is Brandon Osoynik. Is that Brando Commando, erstwhile Brando Commando? Brandon Osoynik. The various peoples in Afghanistan are more ethnically and linguistically Persian, so I don't think they'd smile at Turks being in their country. I can't embarrassingly, I can't speak to that. Isn't Afghanistan like traditionally like, so famously the Mughal Empire was launched. The Mughal Empire that controlled the majority of India. Well, get in trouble saying that, but controlled, the entity that controlled the most of India before the British was launched out of Afghanistan famously. And I always thought that guy was culturally Persian, but actually somewhat Turkic or Mongol. Babar was his name or something like that. The one of the great tragedies of Central Asia, from Edirne to Xinjiang, um, and everywhere in between, is the importation of European nationalism. This is famously what killed the Ottoman Empire. Um, I think a lot of the sort of Central Asian Muslim empires for centuries were very, they'd speak Arabic, their religion was Arab, or sorry, they're not speak, they would write their languages in Arabic scripts. Their religion was from, of Arab origin, of course. Their culture was Persian, and the ruling classes were often Turkic. It was this beautiful sort of melange. And I think, Afghanistan was exactly the same. So I don't know, like the degree to which Pashtuns and the variety of people the wide variety of people in Afghanistan identify as Turkic or against the Turks, or Persian or against the Persians, is a level of complexity I can't really speak to. But I think I can say with great confidence that the Taliban is not going to be looking to the Turks to secure their airport. And I think that's just another statement, like, the Afghan, the U.S. occupied Afghan government that has just fallen, was always going to be something where, like, oh, foreign militaries have to do really basic things like secure the airport, the capital's airport, which is an extraordinarily humiliating thing when you think about it. The Taliban, probably won't need that. The bot with a super chat for $5 says, tell us about Buckingham Palace, George Soros, U.S. presidents, and the World Bank. Well, I suppose for a super chat, I am obligated to tell you something about each of those things. Buckingham Palace is a somewhat ostentatious residence for the Queen of England it's downtown London, right? I've been there. There's guys with silly hats who walk around. I think, it's funny because I think Buckingham Palace is, for a lot of folks, the symbol of the sinister power that the British Empire still exerts everywhere in the world. I mean, it's the Lyndon LaRouches that are big on that, and a lot of people in weird places in the internet will tell you, well, actually, it's the British that still run everything. And the royal family is part of, is at the true head of the Illuminati that runs the world. And one of my favorite things about the television show The Crown, and maybe this is a big subterfuge plot, and the reason why it hasn't been sued out of existence by the British royal family yet, is just the way its depiction of Queen Elizabeth and the people surrounding her. It's just, they're just stupid. Like, they're just kind of dumb people, dumb rich people who sort of, happen to be very powerful and wealthy through some accident of history, and ended up sort of personifying much greater forces than themselves personally. So, I don't think that the British royal family has some sinister power over anything. George Soros is a guy who has done a lot of good, solid, charitable work. Has probably arguably got into it with the national governments of certainly Hungary, and I think probably some other Eastern European countries a little bit, probably exerted a little too much power in those countries that didn't have a lot of wealth and power. Obviously, I'm not going to speak up for Viktor Orban and, like, closing universities, as he did close what's the word? He closed, Viktor Orban closed a George Soros funded university in Hungary. And I think the appropriate sort of liberal elite thing is to be so appalled. But honestly, and you should not close universities, to be clear. But I feel like it's entirely arguable that George Soros's influence in Eastern Europe was a little too big. I mean, this guy's a corporate raider, made a shit ton of money, and I think out of really the goodness of his heart, attempted to design Eastern Europe to the way he thought it should be designed. But at a certain point, and it's almost a sign, I think, of Eastern Europe finding its legs, that there's a bit of a backlash against Soros there. Is the backlash there also like deeply anti-Semitic in troubling ways? Yeah, probably. Is the backlash against George Soros in the United States deeply anti-Semitic or just stupid? Yes, totally. I mean, he's a rich guy who pays to see his political ideas carried out. Like, there's a lot of people like that. And I'm also a very big fan of the Quincy Institute that George Soros is, and weirdly, the surviving Koch brother and George Soros, supposedly these left and right hate each other people, have banded together to create the Quincy Institute, which is one of the only decent think tanks in Washington, D.C., which is one of the only places speaking against this horrific military-industrial complex that I've just been describing for the past 2 hours. So yeah, I mean, George Soros, he's a rich guy who funds politics he likes. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad. If you think he's some kind of Illuminati controller of the world, you're either very stupid or very anti-Semitic. U.S. presidents. Normally I hate U.S. presidents. Like, this is the channel to hate on U.S. presidents. What a bunch of dumb idiots. What a dumb bunch of bozos. Not this week, though. I am very impressed with what Joe Biden has personally done. I think that if it weren't for the personal interventions and personalities of Donald Trump combined with Joe Biden, I think the war in Afghanistan, this incredible grift, would have continued. I think that's the truth, which is to this, today, normally I'd give you a big rant on how much I hate U.S. presidents, but today I'm here. The World Bank is kind of weird or is it the World Bank, the IMF? That's weird. It's like the World Bank and the IMF were established as part of the Bretton Woods system. I wrote a review of a Peter Zeihan book recently. You might have seen, I tweeted it out, talking about just how irritating it was that Zeihan mischaracterizes what the Bretton Woods system was. The Bretton Woods system was a series of fixed exchange rates that were maintained in part by the IMF and the World Bank. I think the World Bank was supposed to do more development work. And the IMF was supposed to provide, the International Monetary Fund was apparently supposed to provide the funds that kept that fixed exchange rate network viable. Of course, Bretton Woods collapsed in 1971, but we've still got the World Bank and the IMF, and they've had to find things to do. I've had a lot of great friends that have worked for the World Bank. Actually, some of my favorite party people on the planet work for the World Bank, and I bet they do some good too. But I'm generally pro international institutions, and I think that the institutions themselves get a lot of hate because of the way the things and the priorities they are directed to have by the U.S. government or the European government. I think the IMF, like, fuck the IMF, yeah, fuck the IMF. Like the problem is like the IMF's funders. Like, the IMF tells the IMF that the IMF doesn't get money unless they force austerity and Washington consensus stuff down the throats of these countries that they're bailing out. Like, it's a democratic problem. Like, it's not the IMF that makes these choices. It's the U.S. and the European governments that have made these choices. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I feel that I didn't have the overarching conspiracy that you might have wanted, the bot, but I feel that I did adequately answer your super chat question. There was another super chat. Man, CRC 2,500. I don't even know what that is. Aren't the Hazaras still holding up? My understanding is that the Hazara are a Shia group, which in Afghanistan, which would be a serious problem for a strictly fundamentalist Taliban group. The question is, so another, I think, misconception of what this incredible Taliban conquest of Afghanistan was that I think some people are characterizing this as like, they blood and thunder, massacred their way across Afghanistan and took full control of everything. No, like what they did was they did deals. They did deals with the local leadership all over the place. And I think that the actual, the Taliban, when it ran, Afghanistan from 1997 to 2001, was an organization that I think by 2001, like as an established organization in a hierarchy, like I'm sure, it grew out of like, I don't know, Mullah Omar's, Fundi, Mujahideen group or whatever. Like it had existed in 2001. It was an organization that had existed for like 6 years, now it is an organization that has existed for a quarter century. And I think has much deeper reserves of restraint, savvy, and political knowledge. So while I can't speak directly to the Hazara thing, I think that the Taliban has made the deals and will hope. Well, the open question is, will it continue to make the deals that compromise its insane principles to keep Afghanistan peaceful? I did very briefly glance at some stuff about the Hazaras, and I know the Taliban has been talking a very good game about tolerance and pleasantness towards the Hazara, but I don't know how true that is. I think that's, of course, one of many things. I mean, like, Afghanistan is a staggeringly diverse place. The Taliban is now in charge of vastly more of it than it ever has been before. Which means that we're either going to see horrific massacres starting up quite shortly, or we're going to see a very different, more competent Taliban. This is an impressive-ass organization. It fought off and defeated the United States of America. So I don't know. We'll see. We shall see. Local Extreme says, More Freedom Foundation, a very common line of thought on Twitter and Reddit is criticism of the lack of commitment against the Taliban from the average Afghan male. Is this valid? Fuck no, it's not valid. As I talked about in my description, we didn't give the Afghan military that much. $87 billion over 20 years is, it's real money, but keep in mind, a lot of even that money, like the $2 trillion figure, again, 1.5 trillion of that just never left the United States, effectively, whether it was going to the salaries of soldiers or the benefits of soldiers or the bank accounts of missile contractors, manufacturers, this, that, and the other thing. 1.5 trillion never left the United States. That money's all swimming around building mansions in Bethesda. And Northern Virginia. The 87 billion that actually went to the Afghan military, a lot of that went back to U.S. contractors for weapons. As I think was pointed out, in a single year, the Afghan military forces, not out of 300,000, a lot of us were ghost soldiers. The Afghan military lost more fighting men in a single year than the United States did in its entire time there, or the entire international forces lost in their entire time there. So yeah, like those, like, oh, they don't want to fight for themselves. Biden also fell into that, unfortunately, because Biden can't, of course, talk about the real enemy in Afghanistan, which is, the grifters of Washington, D.C. So yeah, I think that, and it is very lamentable that Biden and all manner of people have been falling into this. Oh, the Afghans wouldn't fight for themselves. Of course, the Afghans fought for themselves. They fought hard for themselves. We didn't give them any resources, and our goal wasn't to help them win. Our goal was to continue selling weapons into a horrific civil war that now appears to be over. What do you think is going to happen to U.S. weapons now owned by the Taliban? I saw a tweet, but I didn't see any follow-up on it saying that, like, the U.S. was actually, I think that was probably bullshit. That the U.S. was bombing old airfields to destroy the planes that the Taliban now controlled. I don't know if that actually happened. I don't think that has actually. I hope that hasn't happened because that makes the likelihood of the Taliban killing U.S. soldiers higher. Oh wow! I got a PayPal. Thank you, Taha El Gahamoudi. Sorry for mispronouncing that. Let's see here. What do you think is going to happen to U.S. weapons owned by the Taliban? Yeah, I assume most of the small arms, the stuff that's actually useful. It's key to emphasize that a lot of the weapons that the U.S. gave to the Afghan military are going to be useless to the Taliban because a lot of U.S. weaponry is utterly useless, like heavy weaponry, if you don't have U.S. teams to maintain it. So, like famously, the Iranian Air Force was able to keep the Shah's US F-14s running during the Iran-Iraq War, but that was like generations ago. Like the F-35 is famous, which I don't think we gave the Afghans any F-35s, but I think we did give them like F-16s and really, 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 really horrendously complicated helicopters and stuff like that. A lot of this crap needs a fully paid, highly technical contractor force of U.S. technicians to keep it running. And the Taliban will not have that. What the Taliban have gotten is a tremendous wealth, and you've seen the pictures on Twitter of like sort of small arms, whatnot. So even if the U.S. Air Force spent the next couple weeks bombing every plane and helicopter contraption that we'd given to the Taliban, I don't know that it really probably makes that much difference. So yeah, but yeah, all the small arms, the explosives, the ammunition, that's pretty significant. And the Taliban is, of course, better armed than it has ever been. What do you think is going to happen to U.S. weapons now owned by the Taliban? Okay. Yes, Ali Reza, every Iran is a Turk. Get Angel Balzar says, yes, Ali Reza, everyone in Iran is a Turk. Get used to it, fool. Okay. Fadel says Noah Smith thinks the Quincy Institute is a bunch of clowns. Well, Noah Smith, one of my favorite people on Twitter, who blocked me for pointing out that if we start a war if we start World War III with China over Taiwan, the historians are going to know that we're at fault rather than, even if we don't. A guy who blocked me is a guy who's has a lot of very interesting things to say about tech and the economy, and is so incredibly ignorant on foreign policy. It's really kind of extraordinary. It's an indicator of how bad most U.S. foreign policy commentary is, that like people take him at all seriously. So if Noah Smith thinks the Quincy Institute is stupid, that's a tremendous recommendation of the Quincy Institute. That Noah Smith doesn't know a fucking thing about foreign policy. I am kind of it does bum me out a little bit that I can't see what he's saying right now, because I'm sure it's like 70% like really kind of interesting stuff, dealing with like the economics of like the occupation and Afghanistan. He's probably saying like some really clever stuff, and then like 30% like some of the dumbest fucking stuff imaginable, like just like utterly brain dead warmonger, like let's go kill some brown people shit, like, and he won't even know it either, like he'll thinks himself like anyway, whatever. Noah Smith blocked me, so I don't need to think about what his commentary is anymore. And we got Ali Razi says, at Angel Lowell, and somehow these pan-Turks still hate on Iran. So yes, I think we are seeing the impact of European nationalism ideology in these comments with people who are very into the idea of being Turkish or Iranian. Could another government or organization try to overrun Afghanistan? If so, who and why? Yes, of course. I think it is an interesting, even if it is just maybe it is just a Pentagon-inspired myth, but this idea of the Afghan former U.S. occupation government Afghan special forces who have melted into the public and might come back. Those folks, could be the root of any number of things. I mean, famously, the Islamic State grew out of the weird mix of people who were too extreme for Al Qaeda and the formerly secular Baathists. That weird alchemy created the Islamic State, but without sort of Saudi. Well, I think whatever weird group emerges out of that soil will be heavily watered with U.S. Government funding, unfortunately, or maybe Chinese government funding. The prospects, the end of the 40 years of civil war in Afghanistan is something to be celebrated. The chances of the Taliban being good enough stewards to keep the war from reemerging are pretty slim. There are many, many forces, most importantly, all of Washington, D.C., that wants to bring war back to Afghanistan. Who knows? Try to overrun Afghanistan, yes. The Taliban, they're an impressive group of folks. Like maybe they'll actually be able to knit Afghanistan together in a way that it hasn't been knit together since the early 70s. Maybe some new fresh hell of the Bitcoin Mujahideen, are gonna take over. I mean, who knows? I talk a lot about in U.S. politics is how we're in this period of incredible flux. Like, I think we're in that. We're venturing into that period of flux in the Middle East as well. Is like a lot of these old narratives have been sort of completely discredited. The idea that we're gonna fight Israel by going back to the Muslim roots has been just as discredited as the initial idea of independent Arab republics, that we're going to become better Europeans, which will allow us to take back our land, from Israel. That didn't work out. The fundamentalism hasn't worked out. It'd be interesting to see what happens next. Let's see. Fadal says there's an annoyingly large amount of people calling Afghanistan a made-up fake country, as if Germany and Denmark were made by God or something. Yeah, I agree that that kind of lingo is really offensive, and all countries are made-up fake countries. To be clear. Certain countries have a century or two of consolidation and sinking in under their belts. It's important to remember that even the most consolidated nation states on the planet, I would include, the United States. The United States. Well, it's a very different model, but the United Kingdom, England specifically, France, certain parts of China, some of the most consolidated, unified nation states on the planet are really only have like a couple centuries under their belt, unified in the ways that we would recognize. I think Cornish is a language that, there are a number of different dialects of French that were really only stomped out in the 19th century. Like it is. I think when people in Europe and the United States sort of look down their noses at these places, many in Africa, Afghanistan would be another example where they don't have the same degree of homogeneity that the 20th century's genocide, horrific genocides imposed on much of Europe. I think it's a little ridiculous. You should actually look at a place like Afghanistan and the places in Africa and be like, oh, look, these are countries that didn't murder absolutely everybody who disagreed with them. These are countries that actually have a history of tolerance and diversity. And the fact that, a bunch of Saudi, US, and European money hasn't yet gotten them as genocidal as the Europeans and the Americans were, is I think not something to look down on their nose. It's not something that's embarrassingly. It's probably actually a strength. Anyway, but yes, Fado, that's a very good point. Did I miss any super chats? I did not. All right. Well, questions. Questions. Vigermain. I think the Taliban will take advantage of the left Air Force and maintain it like they did before, and they know how to use jets and choppers that bin Laden fought them. What do you think of that take? I think that the technology that the Soviets left behind was better, more user-friendly technology than the United States has left behind. It is tremendously unappreciated how complicated and honestly probably crappy most weapons in the U.S. arsenal are. They are like, just infinitely bespoke, tremendously complicated, technological marvels that with billions of dollars of support can do kind of impressive things, but they're not like the workhorse Hueys of Vietnam or AR-10s or whatnot anymore. It's a lot of stuff. I mean, yes, some stuff the Taliban will be able to maintain and use profitably. Probably by taking out half the shit that the U.S. government put into them. And re-engineering them for sure. But I don't think that they're going to be operating as much of the U.S. left equipment as they were able to operate the Soviet left equipment. Proud Minecrafter asks, will Afghanistan use its mineral wealth to become like Saudi Arabia, an impressive wealthy theocracy? No. Just if for no other reason, just the fact that it doesn't have a sea, it doesn't have a, Saudi Arabia is a real historical anomaly, just to have that particularly useful kind of an industrial commodity that was so infinitely useful everywhere else, to have it in the volumes that Saudi Arabia did, and to have it on a spit of land almost completely surrounded by viable shipping, that because of the Suez Canal could instantly reach Europe very easily, with a little more time and effort, the United States, but is right there next to a straight shot to India and then into Asia. The mineral wealth that Afghanistan has is significant for sure, but it's not as infinitely fungible and available and higher quality than anybody else, and in heavier volume than anybody else that Saudi Arabia has. Saudi Arabia's status is sort of a historical mistake that I still firmly believe we will see corrected by 2030. Even though the successor state to Saudi Arabia will certainly still be pumping oil, even Arabia will not have the incredible economic dominance that it has had. So no, I do not see such extraordinary mineral wealth. Will mineral wealth become a facet in a reward if Taliban manages to actually maintain a centralized government? Yeah, quite possibly, quite conceivably. Yeah, I mean, that's a very distinct possibility, but will it be a Saudi level success? No, no, it will not. Cletus223 says, wasn't the made-up country charge was more about how European and Americans slapped together people who didn't have a reason to be in the same nation to begin with? Yes, but Europeans and nations have done that everywhere. Like Belgium exists because Britain didn't want France or Germany to control it. The United Kingdom is a bunch of people who don't belong together, slapped together because of imperial interests. I think that's entirely true, Cletus223, but that's also describes all countries. Okay, I think we're down to the last 5 minutes. That went very quickly. And I'm also amazed at how many of these questions were actually about Afghanistan. It's usually I do a presentation on something, and then it's like everybody wants to talk about everything else. I guess that's The fall of Afghanistan may not mean much to the U.S. public, but it certainly means a lot to us geopolitics nerds, doesn't it? And it's fascinating how much of this discussion has actually been about Afghanistan. Something that honestly a week ago I didn't know that much about, though I certainly had long-formed opinions just as a news consumer. Generally speaking, what do you think America's role in the world should be? Well, gosh, Daxton, man, that's not a small question. Let me go grab my stuff to spiel, and I'll try to think. What should America's role in the world be? I think that America's role in the world should be to deepen and enrich the system of world government that we put together under the auspices of multilateral organizations like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, make these organizations more truly democratic and capable of not just containing the negative aspirations of places like Russia and China, but the negative aspirations of places like the United States that does things like Afghanistan, like what we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, if we are left unhindered. I think that what we've seen over the past 70 years is kind of an extraordinary period of peace and prosperity. I think a lot of libertarians will tell you, well, it's just nukes, or, oh, it's just everybody decided war is bad. No, I think the United States is, in fact, to a larger degree than is recognized by sort of libertarians and leftists. U.S. power has been responsible for this period of extraordinary peace and prosperity. Unfortunately, I think the greatest threat to this ongoing period of peace and prosperity, certainly over the past 30 years, has been the United States. This is what we see throughout imperial history, that the greatest danger to a powerful empire is most often that empire itself, and corruption and failure within it, as the most powerful entity that the world has ever seen. That goes even more so for the United States. What I would like to see is the United States continue to occupy its leadership role, however, to do so in a almost completely non-military context. I do believe the United States should hold on to the most powerful military on the planet, but should stop using it, because using it is how our downfall will come. That is certainly how the British Empire fell. Continuing to use its military force in an indiscriminate manner throughout Africa and Asia until it pissed off enough people to get enough people to band against them and exhaust them in 2 world wars. I think the U.S. is the most powerful country in human history, will remain to be for another couple decades. And I wish we would use that power for good rather than to make people in the Washington, D.C. suburbs rich. Malex asks, does the world need a hegemon to avoid chaos? And I believe that is the case, in fact, but I'm very biased. I am an American. I am not just an American. I am a white American who grew up without, I wouldn't say we were absurdly wealthy, but, grew up fairly comfortably. So I am one of the great beneficiaries of U.S. empire. I would argue that everyone in the world has benefited to some degree from U.S. empire, but as one of the greatest beneficiaries, I can see why you would think I was biased. All right, we are down to the 2-hour mark. This has been phenomenal. I've been delighted how many folks have been here, how many folks are still answering great questions. Maybe I'll stick around for a little while, but it is time to start spieling. If you want me to stop spieling and answer questions, you would have to do a super chat at this point. My name is Rob Morris. I upload videos every Tuesday at my YouTube channel, The More Freedom Foundation. I am now uploading things every day on TikTok. I haven't done today's yet, which is mostly recut YouTube material, but is also some stuff playing with that format on TikTok. That's at More Freedom Foundation. I can be found on Instagram at More Freedom Foundation. I can be found on Twitter, unfortunately, I just have never gotten around to unifying my brand, but it is, at Robbo Law. So but that is definitely where I spend way too much time. If you had a burning question on here that I did not answer, you can just go ask me at Rabo Law, and I'll, reply briefly, but I will reply. I have written a number of books. We've got this tremendously complicated, but I think more serious addressing of U.S. power than anything else that I've done, called FATCA and the New Birth of American Empire. We all like to talk about military excesses or sanctions or what have you, but the true power of the United States is in just these really boring acronyms like FATCA or CFIUS or OFAC. These things that are too boring to really think about, but are where the real power lies. And this was my attempt to deal with just one of those many aspects of U.S. power that you never hear about. That's FATCA and the New Birth of American Empire. Something that, people used to really, really care about, but I think is slowly fading away and is going to continue to, is everybody's lying about Islam. It was sort of my short book length expose of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the way that it's truly at the root of almost everything we were talking about with terrorism, from Afghanistan to Algeria to 9/11 to San Bernardino and everything in between. I think this probably the most successful of my publications, though it's beginning. I guess it's a good thing that it's beginning to fade away, because nobody really cares about Islamic terrorism anymore, because when the U.S. and the Gulf states aren't funding it, it doesn't really factor that much into anything. That's a fun one. This is a large book called Avoiding the British Empire, which is also sort of my stealth history of the world. Talks a lot about how the United States is making the same mistakes that the British Empire made. I think this book, as occasionally amateurish as it is, talks about the history of the British Empire much more seriously than than most, like Oxford and Cambridge scholars. Talks about how the British Empire was much more powerful than we typically acknowledge. Things like the Great Game and competition with France are actually kind of British imperial propaganda that has somehow made it into the history books. And in truth, the sort of informal empire that the British maintained, well beyond the places that were colored red on the map, is almost an exact analog to what the United States runs worldwide at the moment. And that's why it's so disturbing that the United States seems to be making the same mistakes that the British Empire was making, which could lead to the same place: horrific apocalyptic world wars, which would not be good. That sounds like a mouthful, and it is. It is an almost 400-page book, and I think it's pretty good, and I think you should read it. And please do buy it. The main thing that keeps this channel going is the support of people on Patreon. That is a ongoing crowdfunding thing, sort of like Kickstarter, but keeps on going. For the people who sign up on Patreon, we do this. I do this sort of thing, this live chat thing, twice a month. I do one big public live chat. That's what today is. And then I do a smaller patrons only live chat. Folks want me to talk about all manner of things. There's no way I could cover everything that people want me to cover, but on the monthly patrons only live chat or newscast, I try to talk about everything. I get a list of 10 to 12 things that patrons have asked me to talk about. I spend a day or two researching those 10 to 12 things, very cursory, very briefly, but I think the takes that I give on those 10 to 12 things are still better than anything you'd hear on cable news. Very modestly, I think. And that's for patrons only. So you have to sign up on Patreon to get access to the other live chat that I do each month. And it'd be awesome if you did that, because it's Patreon that keeps me going. You can also, as someone did as we were talking, you can also, thank you, Logo, put the Patreon link in the chat. That was awesome. Thank you. Please join Patreon, folks. And you can also send donations on PayPal. That too is very welcome. Trying to think anything else. I definitely have an upcoming book on U.S. Empire that I think I'm going to try and this thing took me 2 goddamn years. I think I'm gonna hop on Amtrak and take it out to the middle of the country next week, and then I'm going to take the Amtrak back after doing some things out on the West Coast, and I'm going to try and write the entire book on that, or at least get a very solid draft. I'm not going to spend 3 years of my life writing a book like I did with this one. What else? I got my Instagram, we got the TikTok, we got the Twitter. The Twitter is probably the important one. Any last super chats, or I think we can probably call it a day. That was a good solid 2 hours. Thank you all so much. Y'all are the best. And yeah, I ask a lot for people to support me on Patreon. But yeah, I think independent media, especially at moments like this, where you've got the entire world media screaming about this horrific failure of the United States. And I'm just like, wait a second, a 40-year-old civil war is over. Like, I think it's valuable to have people like me here saying things like that. And if you think so too, you could support me on Patreon. Anyway, thank you so much. As Tyler Bozanovsky says, underrated channel. I like to think that as well. Thank you all so much. This has been a ton of fun. And let's all, I don't know whether you're spiritual or not, let's all pray for Afghanistan and hope that this war is in fact over, and that the U.S. withdrawal can finally be completed without any further bloodshed or chaos that keeps it going. Thank you so much.